However, we are grateful to our former Congressman Tim Bishop for coming here to reflect on life after the I was going to say the White House, but no, I'm sorry, the big houses of Congress. Many of you know Tim personally, and certainly most of you know a little bit about him, but I'm still going to tell you a few more things. Tim Bishop joined the faculty of St. Joseph's College of Long Island in 2015 and is currently serving as Distinguished Professor of Civic Engagement and Public Service and as the Director of the Center for Community Solutions at St. Joseph's College. With degrees in history and public administration, his areas of expertise include federal policy, federal higher education policy, transportation and infrastructure, water quality and shoreline protection issues, the federal budget and the Affordable Care Act, the economic collapse of 2008, the American Recovery Act, and the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Bill. From 1973 to 2000, he was employed by Southampton College of LIU in a succession of increasingly responsible administrative positions. For the last 16 years of his tenure, he held the position of campus provost, serving as chief executive officer of the campus and supervising all administrative offices and coordinating academic leadership with the dean for academic affairs. In 2002, he left Southampton College to represent Southampton, New York's first congressional district, one of the few highly competitive seats in the country in the U.S. House of Representatives. His priorities included job creation, protecting middle-class families and seniors, strengthening education, and advocating for veterans, homeland security, fiscal responsibility, and protecting the environment. In the House, he served on committees to increase the affordability of education for all Americans and was recognized as one of the strongest advocates for college access and affordability. As the ranking Democrat on the Water Resources and Environmental Subcommittee, he worked to preserve beaches and waterways. He was one of the 4 co-authors of the Water Resources and Development Act. During his time in Congress, Tim Bishop was a leader on national policy initiatives and a champion for local interests. At St. Joseph's, he is continuing his lifelong commitment to facilitating access to higher education for traditionally underserved populations. In 2015, New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo nominated him as a director of the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation. In addition, he serves as senior advisor at Envision Strategies, a Washington, D.C.-based government relations firm. And finally, Tim serves on the board of directors of Social Accountability International, as well as on the board of a group called Autism Community Experience. These commitments allow him to continue work on 2 of his top priorities, ensuring workplace protections and providing service to veterans, particularly in the area of post-deployment health. It is an honor to have him here with us. Please welcome Tim Bishop.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank Penny for that very kind introduction. She left out that I am my grandson Nathan's t-ball coach. I should have you know I'm missing a game right now. I'm pleased to be here, and one of the things I miss about not being in Congress, there are a few things I miss, there are lots of things I don't, is not having a forum when I feel that I have something I want to say, and I don't really have a forum in which to say it, so I appreciate this opportunity. I'm not sure I'm going to do a lot of reflecting. I'm probably going to talk about some issues that are quite current right now. And I would also very much like to spend most of the time having an exchange with you. So as many questions as people have, I would be happy to try to answer. But by way of reflection, when I entered the Congress in 2003, we were partisan to be sure, but we were not riven by the same kind of animosity and enmity that currently exists. And over the 12 years that I was there, I would say that the collegiality of the Congress went downhill on a consistent basis. And we were criticized for that, justifiably so, when we were criticized for being dysfunctional, justifiably so. But I would say that the dysfunction that currently attends the current Congress makes what we dealt with look like a day at the beach. I mean, this is a spectacularly unproductive and dysfunctional Congress. And I've been reflecting on something that Paul Ryan said. I don't know whether you will remember, but when the Republicans had to pull the American Health Care Act from the floor in March because they didn't have the votes to pass it, he held a sort of painful press conference, painful for him, in which he said that the Republican Party, was grappling with moving from being an opposition party to being a governing party. And I thought that was a very perceptive assessment on Paul's part. But then I got to thinking that the principal reason they're having so much difficulty making that transition is in the underlying philosophy of the Republican Party of 2017, which is that they don't really believe that government serves much of a useful purpose. So when you have that as the starting point of your thought process as it relates to public policy, it's easy to be an opposition party. It's easy to say, don't do that. You're going to be crazy to try that. I mean, that's not going to work. We shouldn't do that. But then when you're entrusted with the responsibility to actually craft public policy, and you don't really believe in the utility of government to do that, it becomes a real challenge. And again, I'm reminded of something that Ronald Reagan was fond of saying, which is that he felt that, he frequently would say that the government that governs least governs best. And he also would sort of augment that by saying that the role of government was to protect our shores, deliver the mail, and get the hell out of the way. And that, in many ways, is the guiding philosophy of the Republican Party of 2017. So, of course, they're struggling with coming up with something that would replace a major piece of social legislation, that is to say, the Affordable Care Act. Flawed as it is, everyone will recognize its flaws. But for them to do what they claimed they were going to do for 7 years, repeal and replace, is now a real challenge. And I was struck, again, until I started thinking about it, like, is this the best you guys can do? I mean, you've been talking about this for 7 years, and you write a bill that only 17% of the American people support. Let me tell you, in an environment that is as divided along partisan lines as bitterly as we are, to do something that only 17% of the American people like is tough. I mean, generally you're going to do something that 35% are going to like, and 35% are not going to like, and then there'll be a group in the middle. But then when you think that for a great many of them, they don't want the government to have a role in ensuring that people have access to health care. And that is reflected in the bill that they wrote and the bill that the House passed. I mean, just half an hour before I came here, the CBO score for the bill that the House passed, whatever it was, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, came out, and the original bill was scored as resulting in 24 million people, 24 million fewer people being insured in 2026 than would be the case under current law, that is to say the Affordable Care Act. The new score is 23 million people will be uninsured. More people will be uninsured than would be the case if the Affordable Care Act were in full force in effect. So it's not a big change. It's not enough to take somebody who was opposed to the bill and said, oh, it only cuts 23 million? Okay, fine, I'll now support that. I couldn't support it at 24 million, but I'll now support it at 23 million. So that's not going to happen. But one of the things that was interesting is that the way, and I'm sorry, let me try to organize my thoughts a little better. They have three big challenges right now. One is the Affordable Care Act, the replacement of the Affordable Care Act. The second is a budget, which was released yesterday. The President's budget was released yesterday. We ought not to overreact, by the way, to the President's budget, because it is not ever going to take on the force of it. And then the third is tax reform. And the dynamic that was established in getting the Affordable Care Act through the House, I think, will result in making it even more difficult to get a budget through the House and the Senate, and then tax reform through the House and the Senate. Why? Because the divisions that exist in the House Republican Conference, there are basically three threads, if you will. One are sort of traditional mainstream Republicans, leader of which is Paul Ryan. And I'm not saying any of this critically, I'm just describing this. The second are the so-called moderate Republicans, what's called the Tuesday Group or the Main Street Partnership, what we might refer to in New York as Rockefeller Republicans, that is to say moderate Republicans. And that's led by a man named Charlie Dent, and until yesterday a man named Tom McAndrews. And then there is the Freedom Caucus, which is the far-right sort of extremist wing of the House. When the House was forced to pull the Affordable Care Act in March, it was because they could not bring on board the Freedom Caucus. There were 30-some members of the Freedom Caucus. They could only lose 23 votes. Nobody in the Freedom Caucus was going to vote for it because they felt that the the American Health Care Act was Obamacare light, that it left in place too many Obamacare mandates. It wasn't ripping it out root and branch. I think I'm quoting Ted Cruz, but I'm not sure. By the way, I won't do that too often. So they are now forced to pull the bill. And what happens? What happens is the bill, in order to pass, gets moved to the right. And that dynamic has empowered the Freedom Caucus, so they know that if they stick together and they speak with one voice, that they're going to be able to drive the bus in terms of policy development in the House. So that then leaves them in charge of the budget process, and that leaves them in charge of tax reform, because they know they have the power to do that. And the challenge will be twofold. One, to the extent that what gets written in the House as it relates to health care, as it relates to the budget, and as it relates to tax reform, that is written in such a way as to appeal to the Freedom Caucus, it costs you moderates. It costs you moderates in the so-called Tuesday Group or whatever they're called. And it also, and even if they can overcome that and get it out of the House, it renders whatever comes out of the House unpassable in the Senate. The bill that passed the House, the American Health Care Act, in its current form is simply unpassable in the Senate. And you've heard, I mean, from the moment the House passed it, senators were saying, well, you know, we let the House do their thing. We're going to do our thing. We're going to take our own look at it. We're going to write our own bill. But here's what will happen, I think, anyway, is that the Senate bill will be more moderate, primarily in terms of what it does, in terms of maintaining as much as possible of the Medicaid expansion. There are already 4 senators who have said that they simply won't vote for a bill that reduces Medicaid enrollment in their states. They can only lose 3 votes. Actually, they can only lose 2 votes. So if they lose those 4, then they're in big trouble. If the Senate accommodates the concerns of those four, then the bill goes back to the House with a much more fully developed Medicaid expansion left intact, where it becomes unpassable in the House. This dynamic, by the way, is the dynamic that was very present the last, I would say, 4 years I was in the House. And it happened time and time again. The House would bring a bill to the floor. They didn't have sufficient votes to pass it. The leadership would bring a vote to the floor. They didn't have sufficient votes to pass it. So John Boehner, who was then the Speaker, had a choice. One choice was to move it somewhat to the left, to try to pick off some moderate Dems, to add to the Republicans who were going to vote for it and pass it, or to move it to the right to accommodate the objections of the far right. And in every instance that I can recall but one, Speaker Boehner chose to move to the right. So now this very far right leading package then goes to the Senate, where for the most part you need 60 votes to pass anything, and it's unpassable. So when people say that Congress can't do anything, they're right, it can. But the reason it can't is because the House has become so ideologically extreme by a small, relatively small number of people. I mean, 32 people is less than 10% of the House, but it is enough to blow up what the majority wants to do. So that's, I have, and by the way, from my vantage point in terms of public policy implementation, if they are incapable of passing a replacement to the Affordable Care Act, I think that's a good thing. Okay? And maybe it will force them to sit with Democrats and do the things that everybody recognizes need to be done to fix the Affordable Care Act. I hope, I think that sounds like wishful thinking, but I would like to think that maybe that will happen. The budget, they have to pass a budget. Now, what will happen in both the House and the Senate is they'll look at what the president submitted. I shouldn't say what the president submitted, what Mick Mulvaney submitted. I mean, that budget proposal has Mick Mulvaney and Mike Pence written all over it. I mean, that is the House budget resolutions of every year from 2011 to the current, sort of on steroids. And that's Mick Mulvaney, who was one of the founders of the Freedom Caucus. But they'll look at it, they might incorporate pieces of it, but they will try to pass a budget, threading the needle of a budget resolution that both brings the moderates on board and the extreme, the conservatives on board, is going to be a challenge. And you might say, well, wait a minute, they passed the budget in 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. Why can't they do it, and 17, why can't they do it for 18? The difference is, they're now the governing party. I mean, they passed a repeal of the Affordable Care Act 62 times. Easy to do when you know it will never be signed into law. But now they know, I mean, so they're all easy votes, free votes. Now they know that whatever they pass has a chance of being implemented into law, and thus they have to live with the implications of what they pass, and so it becomes much, much harder. So I think passing a budget is going to be very difficult for them. But even if they do get one out of the House, how do they then reconcile it with the Senate? Because they have to, if they want to do, I'm taking you into the weeds here, I'm sorry. If they want to do tax reform with what are called reconciliation instructions, you all know what I mean when I say reconciliation. Okay. If they want to pass that, they have to pass if they want to have reconciliation instructions, they have to pass the same budget resolution, House and Senate. And that resolution has to have reconciliation instructions that protect passage of tax reform with 51 votes as opposed to 60. That's going to be a real challenge. The other challenge they have is they can't go there. They cannot pass a fiscal 18 budget resolution. Let me say it differently. Yes, they cannot pass a fiscal 18 budget resolution prior to the passage of whatever health care bill they come up with, because Once they pass a budget resolution for fiscal 18, the budget resolution for fiscal 17 becomes moot, and that budget resolution for fiscal 17 provides them with the reconciliation protections to pass health care out of the Senate with only 51 votes as opposed to 60. So there's a timing issue. I mean, when Mitch McConnell says, we may not get to health care till July, and that, we go in recess the end of July, and we're going to pass. We may vote on it in July, may not vote on it till September. This is health care. We're now all of a sudden only 30 days from the start of fiscal 18, and pretty soon they're going to have to pass appropriations bills, which normally follow a budget resolution. Don't have to, but normally do. And they're also going to run out of floor time because things take forever in the Senate. So I think that my own view is that the dysfunction that we have seen in the first 4 months and change of this Congress is going to intensify, and I think their difficulty in passing meaningful legislation is going to become pretty acute. I could be wrong. There could be some changes of heart on both the moderate side and the far right side, but I don't know. I will also say this, and then I'll stop and I'll be happy to take your questions. I don't mean to be flip, but I found it almost amusing that the president was negotiating with the Freedom Caucus over changes to the health care bill. Because I don't think anyone would accuse him of being a policy wonk. He doesn't seem to have an understanding of the issues associated with the Affordable Care Act and providing coverage, particularly given the things he said, which is that his plan is going to be beautiful and tremendous, and it is going to ensure more people with better coverage at less cost. I don't think we're there. So he's sitting down with the Freedom Caucus people who, say what you want about them, are very principled people. And they very much want the policies that they support to align with their principles. So they're in the weeds. They're focusing on the granular aspects of a piece of legislation, and Trump's at the 30,000-foot level saying, I need a win here. And no wonder it didn't work. I mean, no wonder that the president wasn't able to close the deal and get them to vote on something in March, because he wasn't able to speak their language. I mean, they want to know where he stands on essential benefits and community rating, and he's scratching his head saying, what do those things mean? So anyway, and so I don't know how much of a player. I mean, he does know more about tax reform than he knows about health care. I don't know how much of a player he will be, and if he is a player, whether his involvement will be helpful or a detriment. But I think the Congress is in for a very, very rough and very, very unproductive session. And I think that, and as again, from the policy perspective that I would bring to the table, I don't think that's a bad thing, although I promise this will be the last thing I say. If we aren't going to pass meaningful replacement of the Affordable Care Act, then everybody's got an obligation to get on board and make what we have now work. And when the president, on Monday, the president asked the court to defer for an additional 90 days, the administration having to take a position on a lawsuit that House Republicans filed that could render illegal the payment of the cost-sharing reduction payments. You all know what I mean by the cost-sharing? Okay. So what's happening when the president says, Obamacare is dead, and the markets have collapsed, and the insurers are pulling out, and so on. A lot of this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. What do insurers want more than anything else? They want certainty. And we haven't given them any certainty. They have no idea where the Affordable Care Act is going to go. The president issues an executive order that makes it look as if the federal government is no longer going to enforce the individual mandate, which is a key to predicting rates for the insurance companies, and then we're, dancing around with the cost sharing reductions, and the Kaiser Foundation has estimated that if we pull the cost sharing reductions, premiums for that reason alone will go up 19%, irrespective of any other factor. Premiums will go up by 19%. So is it any wonder that insurance companies are putting together their plans for the upcoming enrollment year with pretty high numbers, because they have to protect themselves, particularly since the Republicans pulled the funding for something called risk corridors, which was a component of the original bill that was designed to provide funding to insurance companies who basically made bad guesses. Because let's be honest, when they were putting together their packages, their policies for the first couple of years of the Affordable Care Act, they were guessing. It was brand new. So they didn't know. And we built into the bill something called risk corridors, which was a pool of money that would allow insurance companies to have that insurance companies could access, that would allow them to smooth out their business plan. That's now going also. So insurance companies are working without a net, and it's a real challenge for them. And I'm not shedding a tear for insurance companies, but we have given them a very, very steep challenge. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions. Yes, Joe?
The question I have is it coincidental that the entrenchment and the hyper-partisanship and the lack of cooperation between the parties all seems to have occurred it started right around the time of Citizens United. What the campaign finance changes, what effect have they had on all this?
I'll take it back 1 year from Citizens United to the redistricting that followed the 2010 elections. But I think the combination of the massive amounts of money that now flow into races and the fact that we have so many gerrymandered districts in the country, both of those result in combined, they have a synergistic effect, I think, result in the hyper-partisanship that we have. I'll just tell you an anecdote. One of my really good friends in Congress was a man named Kevin Brady, Republican of Texas, chair of the Ways and Means Committee. Our offices were next to one another, and we played baseball together, so we don't have anything in common politically. But he's a wonderful guy, and we got along. Every year, he had a primary. And I would say, Kevin, who's primarying you? He said, some guy that's, is to the right of you. And I would say, Kevin, how the hell do you get to the right of you? But what it was is he had voted for TAR. And so that's his scarlet letter, that he had voted for TAR, and that he'll carry with him for the rest of his career. But his district is so homogenous, I mean, that all he has to worry about is his right flank. He never has to worry about centrists, and he never has to worry about people on the left. And that's because of the way we've drawn our districts. And so the fact that so few members on both the left and the right have to worry about, that the only thing they have to worry about is being primaried by someone more extreme than them, both on the left and the right, yields a kind of hyper-partisanship that is part and parcel of why we've become as unproductive and as partisan we are. And then layer on top of that the ungodly amounts of money that are now spent on races that come from a relative handful of people. By the way, if you have not yet read Dark Money by Jane Mayer, read it. It's both illuminating and terrifying. And the other thing that I think has happened all of a piece is the reason that elections have become as hyper-partisan as they are and as pervasive as they are. I mean, we're in a permanent election cycle in the House, is that the differences in the parties have become so pronounced that being in the majority matters much, much more than it used to. In the days of Tip O'Neill and Bob Michael, they weren't that far apart. But now the parties are so much further apart that yields these bitter, bitter bitterly contested races, which then make it very hard to be, collegial with your colleagues. An anecdote. I was elected in 2000, re-elected in 2010 with the smallest margin of victory in the country. I think I won by 593 votes, and the election wasn't decided until December 8th, a month after the election. So I get sworn in on January 3rd, and I'm feeling pretty good. I'd survived a tough election. On January 4th, this is the honest to God truth, the National Republican Campaign Committee delivered to my office a retirement package with all the forms that I would need to file to retire. And the message was retire voluntarily before we retire you involuntarily. And I thought that was kind of funny, but at the same time, I'm now supposed to go into a committee and lock arms with a Republican colleague and work together. I'm thinking, it's a real challenge, but it's money, it's redistricting, and it's the fact that the parties have become so different. I mean, let's be honest. Can anyone imagine a Republican president today signing into law the Environmental Protection Agency? I mean, inconceivable. Inconceivable. Can anyone imagine a Republican president signing something called the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act? Inconceivable. But at the time, I was Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, at the time, the parties weren't all that different. We had philosophical differences, we had tactical differences, but there was a lot of commonality. That commonality is all gone, it seems to me. I hope that answers your question.
The Supreme Court decision just this week on the gerrymandering that took place
in North Carolina. In North Carolina, that might open the door to other. It only opens the door. I'm not a legal scholar by any stretch, but it only opens the door to gerrymandering that has racial implications. Because that's the basis on which the North Carolina districts were invalidated. But they're not the only districts where minorities have been packed into districts and others have been, are in other districts. So it might have some impact, but what we really need, my opinion, is we need nonpartisan redistricting commissions in every state. That, by the way, districting, reapportionment and redistricting is done state by state, each with their own policies. There's not a federal mandate. And a couple of states have done it. Iowa has nonpartisan redistricting. California does. And when California did it, their delegation, largest delegation in the Congress, I think 55 members, their delegation changed considerably when the lines were drawn based on, to make geographic sense as opposed to partisan sense. Yes?
That was great. Thank you very much. I have a very simple question. In addition to what you've just said, what else is there to be done to get us out of the terrible problem in which we find ourselves?
Well, out of the hyper-partisanship and out of the paralysis. I think the big ones are redistricting and are limiting the amounts of money that can be spent on campaigns and moving to, I mean, this is politically unattainable, but moving to public financing of campaigns. I think those two would be crucial to reducing the temperature, if you will, in terms of the partisanship that paralyzes them. And also, I mean, part of what's happened also is that our population self-segregates. So it's not just that Kevin Brady's district has been drawn in such a way as to fit every Republican you could possibly find in there. It's that there was an awful lot of Republicans living there to begin with because of how the population sort of self-sorts. So I wish I had better thoughts on it, but I do think those two are the key.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
You haven't mentioned the elephant in the room, which is the Russian investigation and its impact on both the Senate and the House's ability to function.
Thank you. I think it's going to, I mean, this is not a profound statement by any means, but I think it's going to have a very deleterious impact on the ability of the House and the Senate to do their work. It's certainly going to impair policy development, and I mean, Paul Ryan is frequently been quoted as saying, "Hey, look, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can deal with this, plus we can pursue our public policy agenda." I'm not sure that's true, and I'm particularly not sure it's true in the Senate, because the Senate moves at a glacial pace to begin with, and to be encumbered by all these different investigations and all of these, a revelation a day, a bombshell a day. It's at a minimum, it's distracting. So I think that just layers on an additional degree of difficulty to moving their agenda, I think. And by the way, I think the investigations are great. I'm not suggesting that we should, pursue public policy at the expense of these investigations. I think the investigations are absolutely essential. Yes?
Where do we, how does it look for 2018? And secondly, do you plan to be involved in 2018?
If you mean by plan to be involved, do I plan to run? The answer is no. Well, the answer is no. I certainly do plan to make my voice heard, and I certainly do plan in this district to support whoever the Democratic candidate is. And I think too early to tell, but I think 2018 has the potential to be a wave election in the same way that 2006 was for the Dems and 2010 was for the Republicans. And I think what happened last night in the 9th Assembly District, where a Democratic, it was an open seat because Joe Saladino became the Oyster Bay Town Supervisor, that seat has been in Republican hands for decades. And Trump carried that district by 60%. The Dem won 58-42. Now, special elections are not necessarily instructive because they're all based on turnout and there's not a lot of voters that come out. But that result, I do believe, reflects the passion and the anger that so many people on the left have as a result of the 2016 election. Whether that can be maintained and whether that can translate into the only thing that matters, which is actual votes, remains to be seen. But I remember in 2009, here on Long Island, when Tom Suozzi lost. Everybody thought he was bulletproof. Everybody thought there was no way Tom Suozzi was going to lose re-election. Very popular Nassau County exec. He lost and lost badly. And another Suffolk County legislator running for re-election, a young man named Brian Biedenbender, who wound up working for me, lost. Those two races were the canary in the coal mine for 2010. They showed that there was a wave building, and then that wave engulfed us all in 2010. So can it happen? Absolutely it can happen. Will it? I think it's too early to say. Yes?
Hi. Regarding the Assembly District 9 votes, I would like you to speak to, instead of everything you say about, the current administration I'm on board with, I think we also need to really, Democrats need to look at themselves and take responsibility for what they're doing right and a lot of what they're doing wrong. For example, the Suffolk County, the Dem guy, Rich Schaefer, he didn't endorse this candidate who won. And it's all this cross endorsement and you do for me, I'll scratch your back. So all that kind of stuff. It was all the grassroots people that got her elected.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's going to make everything happen, is if people are willing to get up and do things differently, or do them the way they used to. Go to every single door and vote, talk to people and stuff.
That works.
So talk about the...
Right, that works. That does not work in a congressional election. Okay, I will just tell you. You cannot go to 710,000 doors. You just cannot. So can it work in an assembly district or a town council race or a town trustee race, yes, it can. But it cannot work. I always used to be, whenever I heard my opponent was out knocking doors, I always thought, this is great. Because what I was doing was I was calling people to raise money, and I could raise enough money to reach 40,000 households, while the time that guy was knocking on 15 doors or 20 doors. So, so each race, or each level is different based on the number of people you have to reach. I do think Dems have to do a very careful assessment of what went wrong in 16, and I think that, look, I will say this about President Trump. He, I think, was a genius at putting his finger on what the American people, or a significant subset of the American people, were thinking, and he spoke to that frustration, that disillusionment, that disenfranchisement with great clarity. I don't think very honestly, but with great clarity. He spoke to them and said to them what they wanted to hear, and they trusted him. We did not do a good job of that. We did not do a good job of identifying the issues, nor did we do a good job of speaking to those issues. And we really need to get much, much better at that than we have been. And so I think, there's an awful lot of work going on right now. I can't speak for what's going on in the county, but I will say that nationally, there's an awful lot of work going on right now that pretty much amounts to an autopsy of what went wrong in 2016 and what we have to do to fix it. Yes, and now, Joe, I'll come to you. Yes.
Yes. We hear about the rising cost of health insurance all the time. Why hasn't Congress repealed McCarran-Ferguson, which exempts the health insurance industry from the interstate commerce clause of the Constitution? Repealing McCarran-Ferguson would allow health insurance companies to sell insurance across state lines.
Yes. I'm not sure that selling policies, allowing policies to be sold across state lines, is the silver bullet that solves the problem. So I'm not
50%. Maybe.
No, not necessarily. A couple of things. Number one, there is a provision in the Affordable Care Act that provides states with money to develop consortial arrangements with other states so that they can come together and sell their policies. So I'm making this up now. I don't think any state has pursued this provision, but New England states and New York could conceivably form a consortium, and a policy that was available in New York would also be a policy available in Maine and so on. So that's in the bill. I don't think anyone has taken advantage of it, not that I can cite, but the potential exists. The other is, it's not as simple as allowing policies to be sold across state lines if you also do away with the essential benefits package. If you keep the essential benefits package and have that apply to all 50 states, then the variation in cost for the policies will not be that great because they're all covering the same thing. If, on the other hand, states adopt the waiver that the McAndrews Amendment allows in the health care bill, then they can do away with essential benefits and sell policies that may or may not be all that useful. I mean, one of the reasons that the Affordable Care Act has an essential benefits package is we said that everybody had to have a policy. If you say everybody has to have a policy, you have to define what a policy is. And so that's what we did. Now, if you take away the ability to define what a policy is on a national basis, I think what you set up is a race to the bottom if you allow companies to sell across state lines. Now, I could be wrong, and this is obviously a subject that you've given a great deal of thought to. But all I will say is that one of the things, my experiences of the summer of '09 are indelibly etched in my memory. Okay, all I did all summer was talk healthcare. Actually, I tried to defend myself and then talk healthcare. But I went back to Washington along with a great many of my colleagues saying we have to figure out some way to allow policies to be sold across state lines, and that's how we came up with this idea of consortial arrangements. Joe?
The last administration that balanced the budget was the Clinton administration, and they even had a surplus. Bush ramped it up, Obama ramped it up, now we have an unsustainable $22 million debt. Trump has presented a kind of Disneyland budget with predicting robust goings-on, adding to the military, detracting from benefits. Is it really unsustainable to keep this? I fear what's going on with the Trump.
I think very good question. Let me say a couple things. We've had 4 balanced budgets since World War II. 3 of them were under President Clinton. Remember how bad the presidency was, right? And one I think was Eisenhower, but I don't remember. But Ronald Reagan never had a balanced budget. George H.W. never had a balanced budget. And the Trump budget, as you say, is Disneyland. I mean, it is illusory to think that it's going to balance in 10 years. And by the way, Paul Ryan has written lots of budgets that balance in 10 years. Let me tell you, if you use revenue as a plug number and you use expense as a plug number, every single person in this room can balance the federal budget in a half an hour. Okay? I'm serious. If you simply assert what your revenue is going to be with no backup and assert what your expense is going to be with no backup, it's a piece of cake. Now, there have been 3 bipartisan efforts to plot out our long-term future. There was Domenici Rivlin, Pete Domenici and Alice Rivlin. There was Simpson Bowles at Commission, and there was the so-called Gang of 8, 4 Dems, 4 Republicans in the Senate. They all pretty much came to the same place, which is that our future financial stability lies in pursuing 3 paths. One is a gradual reining in of the growth of the entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, a point I will return to in a second. The second was a leveling off of the rate of growth of both domestic, non-defense domestic discretionary, and defense. And the third is revenue increases, that is to say tax increases. All 3, all bipartisan, all 3 said the same thing. Now, you might ask why we haven't pursued any of those. And the reason none of those have been pursued is because they're all inordinately difficult. On taxes, I think there's 240 Republicans in the House. I think 237 of them have signed the Grover Norquist no tax pledge. They'll never vote for a tax increase of any kind. So tax increases is a non-starter in the House. And the entitlements, particularly Social Security and Medicare, are very challenging. 48 cents of every dollar the federal government spends is on retirees. Social Security, Medicare, and that portion of Medicaid that funds people in nursing homes and senior assistance programs, and 48 cents of every dollar we spend. So to think that we could do what Mick Mulvaney has just produced, which is that we're going to balance the budget and not touch Social Security and not touch Medicare, puts enormous pressure and increased defense by 10%, puts enormous pressure on non-defense domestic discretionary, to the point where the safety net ceases to exist, and things that we don't even think are in the safety net, like college work study, and loan repayment forgiveness if you go into public service career, are eliminated. So I don't think anyone would think, Mick Mulvaney might think it's a good idea, but I don't think too many other members of Congress think it's a good idea. So it's a real challenge. And then when you start looking at Social Security, just real specifically at Social Security, the average Social Security recipient makes about $14,000 a year from Social Security. A third of seniors in this country, Social Security is their only income. So a third of the people over 65 only get $14,000 a year. Another third, let me just finish this, Joe. Another third, Social Security represents over half of their income. So 2/3 of the senior population in this country makes less than $28,000 a year. So we're going to go to them and say, look, You don't understand. We have to balance the budget, you know, and so we're going to ask you to get by on 13, not 14. That's a tough conversation to have. You know, so it's a real challenge. It does not lend itself to simple, you know, answers that look good on a bumper sticker. It's really, really challenging, and it's why it hasn't been dealt with.
Well, what is the reality if the debt keeps ballooning? What will happen to us if that's true?
Well,
Is it a doomsday?
no, I don't think it's a doomsday, because I honestly, call me a Pollyanna, but I don't think policymakers will let it get that far. But most economists say that an annual deficit, as opposed to the debt, an annual deficit of no more than 4% of GDP is manageable. That's what most economists will say. In fact, there are lots of people that consider the budget to be in virtual balance if it covers everything but debt service. And our debt service is, I think, $200 billion a year, I think. But over time, that number accumulates. And we're right now, I think, at 77% of GDP is our accumulated debt is 77% of GDP. That's the highest it's been since World War II. And I think most people feel the breaking point is when you get to 100% of GDP. We're not that far away. But I mean, when I hear, you know, when we were in the majority, when Bush was in the White House, we Dems were all over him on accumulation of debt, and this is irresponsible and so on. And then all of a sudden, Obama and the Republicans were saying, "Hey, come on, we got to keep the economy going." Then the presidency changes, and all of a sudden our roles change. You know, so it is something though that we must contend with. Your observation is right there. I don't know what the point at which we fall off the cliff is, but at some point we will get there. Yes, ma'am.
The Affordable Care Act effectively is going to be killed without repealing it because insurance companies are going to raise their premiums and the federal government is not going to fund the subsidies. The whole thing's going to collapse.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, the question, or the statement was that the Affordable Care Act is going to essentially go away without being repealed because the insurance companies are going to raise their rates such that they will be unaffordable, and the federal government is not going to pay the subsidies. That is the doomsday scenario. I would suggest that the political implications of that are such that the Republicans will not allow that to happen because I don't know whether you saw the clip of Nancy Pelosi saying, as she spoke when they were passing that Health Care Act, that you've got every provision of this bill tattooed on your forehead. And she's right. And if all of a sudden insurance markets collapse, and if all of a sudden millions of people are without insurance, they're not going to come looking for Nancy Pelosi or Barack Obama. They're going to say, you're in charge, you allowed this to happen, what are you going to do to fix it? So I think that the political imperative will outweigh whatever policy difficulties the governing party has. That's my hope. I hope I'm right. Yes. Yes.
Can you put on your future 2019 cap and see what the Democrats are going to put up?
I'm really bad at this. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I can cite the same names that you've read, but I don't have any kind of...
Who would you like to see?
I'd like to see somebody who can win, okay? That's the only measure. So, I don't know. Is it Elizabeth Warren? Is it Cory Booker? I don't know. I have no idea. The field is pretty broad right now. It'll sort itself out. And Larry, I'll come to you in a second. But you had a question, the Blue Star?
It was a comment, and I know it's not easy, but with Social Security, FICA taxes haven't been raised in how many years?
I think the last time they were raised was 1983.
The 1% of the population, they pay all of their FICA taxes the first week of the year. Just to raise that slightly.
I agree with you. My own view is that we should raise the cap. We should raise the cap so that more money flows into the Social Security Trust Fund. And look, we swallowed it in 1983. The economy didn't collapse. So I think you're right. I think we should do that. Larry.
Specifically in terms of CD1, while we're waiting for the tsunami or whatever you should call it, what are we to do? We live in almost a gerrymandered district. 80-some-odd% of the district is Republican. What do we do? While we're waiting, Coach.
You'd always become a distinguished professor. I'm kidding. Well, let me say a couple things. One, the district is really not 80% Republican. It's roughly, these are round numbers, 40% Republican, 30% Democrat, 30% unaligned or blank. Okay, so Republicans are clearly the dominant party, but they are not the governing party. I mean, they don't have, their elections are not a lock. Although I will say that I think the district has moved significantly to the right in terms of its political orientation since the election of Obama. That's just my observation. But I think what people should do who feel strongly about the current state of affairs is that they should make their positions known every bit as graphically as people made their positions known to me in 2009 and 10 and 11 and 12 and 13 and 14. We should let Congressman Zeldin know where we stand. And we should demand, just as people demanded of me, we should demand that he tell us where he stands with as much specificity as possible. I think that's the job of being a member of Congress. You represent 710,000 people, and they have every right to know where you stand and why you stand there. And people have every right to make their feelings known. Now, I would hope that however we express ourselves, we would do it with civility, in contrast with how a great deal of information was transmitted to me in 2009 and thereafter. I think that the coarsening of our political discourse, its most recent iteration began with the Tea Party, which came to power in 2009, and I think it's been exacerbated by the ugliest presidential campaign, at least that I can remember in my lifetime, having taken place in 2016, and the person for the responsible for the ugliness actually won. So I think that sets up a dynamic that's not productive. But I also don't think we should respond in kind. My view is that we should be forceful, we should be passionate, we should be willing to put ourselves on the line, but we should do it with respect and with civility. That's, I think, very important. Yes. Yes.
I appreciate so much hearing somebody knowledgeable and intelligent talk to us.
Did my mother say anything?
No, it's just there's so much, it's like distractions like this that you have, like this is, I've been to your town hall meetings, you speak to the point. There's so many questions, but I was wondering, part of what I was wondering is, what is the impact of the immigration policies to the economy, to our image in the world, to so many things?
Yeah, I'm very worried about that. And I'm going to leave aside the most important part of immigration policy and immigration crackdown, which is the humanistic part of it. I'm going to leave that aside. Just speaking for this district, whether we like it or not, we have an economy that attributes some of its vibrancy to the availability of a workforce that is an immigrant workforce. Some of you may have heard me say this before. Suffolk County remains the largest agricultural producing county in the state of New York. Very few people recognize that, but we are. And over 50% of the farm work done in Suffolk County is done by undocumented immigrants. Now, that isn't because farmers enjoy breaking the law. It is because they have an imperative, and that is to bring in their crop so that they can feed their family and feed the population that depends on what they grow. So when we have 50% of the largest, agricultural producing county in the state is dependent on an immigrant workforce, what does that tell you? It tells you we have to fix this. And rounding them up and sending them back isn't going to fix it. A deportation force isn't going to fix it. A wall isn't going to fix it. We have to become much more enlightened and do what the Senate tried to do in 2013, which is pass comprehensive immigration reform, which they did on a bipartisan basis, 64 votes in the Senate. It's hard to get 64 votes for a post office in the Senate. They did. So all rhetoric to the contrary, all invoking of MS-13, which I'm not diminishing their impact, but it's a separate discussion. You know what I mean? I'm not diminishing. I don't mean to say I'm not diminishing how evil that organization is, and we have to deal with it. But it clouds the discussion when we're trying to deal with, in the main, law-abiding people who want the same things out of life that we do. So I think we have to fix it. David, and I got to take. We have to. Some people have to leave at quarter, so we'll take a few more questions. Yeah.
I want to get back to Christine Pellegrino. Since the election, there have been at least 40 groups, resistance groups, that have arisen in CD1. There's a huge outpouring. I've been canvassing, other people have been canvassing. If you knock on the door of people now and ask them what's worrying them, there's only one thing that's the answer, and that is Trump. I think that they say Trump. What's bothering me is Trump. So with all this energy and these resistance groups, my questions are twofold. Would you recommend, for those of us that are doing this, and would you recommend for the Democratic parties across the district on how to harness the energy to the ultimate goal, which is to...
I think the greatest challenge that the resistance groups have is maintaining the passion and the outrage. It's just as a human dynamic, it's hard to do. I mean, eventually you calm down, right? I mean, so I think that it's absolutely essential that the passion and the outrage be maintained, and that, David, part of it is leadership. It's people like you, and you're doing a phenomenal job of continuing to keep groups energized and active and engaged. That's important. I think the party leadership has to, the Richie Schaefers of this world have to make sure that the efforts are coordinated. He's had a couple of meetings in which he's brought in groups that are all doing the same thing and trying to bring together some cohesion. And then I think one of the things that I have sort of charged myself with is making sure that the DCCC puts this district on their so-called red to blue list, so that they recognize that this is a district that can flip. Its whole history is that of flipping. And that they need to invest resources in this district. And that's something that I said, that I think is my responsibility. But what you and others are doing makes achieving the result that I am trying to get much easier.
I have not seen any abating of the energy. In fact, I've seen the contrary.
Great.
New groups popping up all the time.
Great. I think that's right. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could just help me understand. They did a study that just recently that said that 98% of the people that voted for Trump are still for Trump. I understand that many of the people are born like baby ducks, and they get imprinted when they're children, and they're going to be Republicans no matter what. But I would think that trauma changes that, and I think we're traumatized.
I would say a couple of things. I was never taken by that number. I was a little taken aback by that number. But let's remember that was done about 3 months into his presidency, and it's hard to admit you're wrong. I mean, it's hard. I mean, look, he engendered an enormous amount of passion, and an enormous amount of loyalty, and an enormous amount of commitment. And it's hard to let go of those things. And it's hard to say, you know what? He sold me a bill of goods. I bought it. Shame on me. It's hard to do that. Now, like I said, it's only 3 months into his presidency and, or at the time that poll was taken, if the investigations continue to yield the kind of information that we've been seeing, I think, again, too early to determine what the outcome will be, but certainly what we've seen thus far gives a reasonable person pause. And if he continues to pursue policies that are really, really hurtful to huge swaths of the American people, then I think over time, people will say, you know what, I was wrong. But, remember, we're like I said, we're 4 months into a 48-month deal. I'm going to go to Mackie, and then I'll go to...
Okay, if Mackie has a 20-second question, our clock is slow, and I know some people have to leave, so...
Right, the
Mackie,
principal problem, Penny, has been my answer.
The one issue here that everybody allegedly agrees on is the infrastructure issue. Is there any chance that Congress can put aside the other big issues, work on that, get money flowing into the country, get jobs, and then taxes flow back in, and then turn to some of the other stuff you could agree, use great credibility to Congress, say, let's do something. Is there any chance?
There's a chance, but the budget that came out yesterday is not terribly hopeful. It cuts the money coming out of the Highway Trust Fund to the states to fund infrastructure projects, and it creates this sort of undefined fund of $200 billion over 10 years, so $20 billion a year, to seed investment in infrastructure that would bring private money to the table. Not too many Dems are going to support that. I don't think too many Rs are going to support it, frankly. So what we need to do, in the same way that we need to raise the cap on Social Security, we just got to face up to the fact that we got to raise the motor fuels tax, bring more money into the Highway Trust Fund, and make our investments in infrastructure through that. Real quick, we got one? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
We're a beacon of light in somewhat dark times, I have to say. But, and I can see that our loss is your gain. You look wonderful, and I'm very happy for you and Kathy in the back to have a bit more of your life back. Of course, we appreciate what you did for us more than we can tell you. And it's wonderful to know that even though you're not in Washington, you are here, and that you'll come and visit with us once in a while. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for coming.